let's get going. Hi, everyone, again. Thanks for joining. We're so excited to be here with you today and talk about our favorite topic, which is hardware development with all of you. My name is Valentina. I'm one of the co-founders of Allspice. And before Allspice, I was an mechanical engineer by training, and I worked as an Amazon PM for several years in infrastructure projects. And I'm here today with Kyle and Kata.
My background is electrical engineering. I did product development for a while, both on consumer electronics and some government products. Really excited to talk through that process with you.
And I'm Kata Henning. I am the Director of Business Development for a San Francisco-based product engineering firm called Alloy. And I joined Alloy at the beginning of this year. I have a non-technical background, but I'm fond of saying I know enough to be dangerous. My first foray into the hardware scene was about 2014 when I worked for a San Francisco-based hardware startup accelerator. So I have a lot of experience working with startups, figuring out go-to-market strategy, all of the different stages of prototyping. And then most recently, before joining Alloy, I was with an NPI firm, so helping customers develop their manufacturing and supply chain management strategy. So I've been sort of living in the world of mass production globally.
All right. So we have a few questions that people submitted beforehand to go over today, and we'll give you a brief overview of what we do at Allspice and Alloy, and then we'll jump straight into the questions. If you have new questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat. We're going to be reading those and then answering throughout or at the end of the session as well. But I'm excited to hear also what else you want to know about and what else we can answer for you. So a bit about Allspice and what we do. We are a Git platform made for hardware, which is based on proving software development practices and principles. Our main focus is providing revision control and collaboration that's Git-based for electrical engineering teams to help accelerate development of the next generation hardware products.
And Alloy PD, we're fond of using the terms around craft mastery. And some of the products that Alloy has worked on I think we're in our 13th year of operation, are down in the bottom. They're also on Alloy's website. We work with companies, some startups that are funded, but also Fortune 100, Fortune 50 companies, often on products that haven't been done before. And often working with companies as early stage as napkin sketch, so ideation, conception of what a new product might be, and working with them all the way through into mass production, so usually like EVT and DVT, and then by the time a product gets to stable mass production, we are often not needed anymore.
And with that, we'll go straight into questions for today. The first question, just to set the stage and the context, is what are the basic development stages across different hardware companies? And how about Kata, you tell us from your experience at Alloy what you see?
Sure. So, the great thing about making physical products is there are some similarities for making anything that's a physical good that you can touch, feel, be delighted by, and all the rest of it. And what I love is when I was working for a startup accelerator, you get to see the really early stages of product development, of prototyping, of bringing ideas, potentially IP, all the way through. And then during my days at Dragon, it was sort of seeing the very tail end of some of that. Like, how do you move into stable production for hundreds of thousands of units per year or millions of units per year? So this is kind of a very high level overview, but generally, you start at sort of the idea stage, the conception stage. At Alloy, we use the term sort of for evaluation. So a phase one might sort of be, let's evaluate where the idea is. Let's help you define what the requirements are. Often that in the documentation takes the form of, a product requirements document. The business side counterpoint to that will be you might need a marketing requirements document and that type of thing. Once you sort of move into prototyping stage, this is obviously like a very iterative cycle. At Highway 1, we were fond of using a phrase that was sort of like the rule of sevens. And I'm not quite sure why we picked seven. Eight's a luckier number in sort of the Far East, so maybe we'll use 8. But the whole point is fail early, fail often, fail where it's not as costly, both to your actual dollars and also your time, and where the failures aren't sort of catastrophic. So the rule of sevens or 8s was, it takes sort of 7 seconds to sketch something out on a whiteboard. It might take, 7 minutes to mold something using modeling clay. It might take 7 hours or longer to do a 3D print. And then when you're actually doing things like sending prototypes out that might need to be machined, for example, could take 7 days. And then if you're actually doing for plastics like injection molding, like maybe 7 weeks. I mean, I think rough rule of thumb was like 40 business days for cutting hard steel tools. But anyway, the point is, it's obviously a lot easier to fail by doing 7-second drawings and really trying to refine the idea down and make it as high fidelity as you can at each stage before moving on. So at Alloy, we actually do something pretty interesting. You guys have probably heard the terms proof of concept prototype. At Alloy, we sort of break it down in that evaluation stage to what are the highest risk subsystems. And sometimes that actually could be the highest risk is integrating the whole subsystems, if it's like a very large physical product, for example. And the point then is during sort of the, phase 2 or the proof of concept stage, it's a lot faster to just prototype each of those subsystems rather than trying to spend a lot of time integrating all the subsystems together, unless, of course, that ends up being, a tough touch point. So usually, doing those subsystem prototypes in a proof of concept stage is how Alloy approaches things. And then sort of Alloy's phase 3 would be what we call a proof of design. You may, in other terminology, have heard this called an integrated works like, looks like prototype. If you're a startup, oftentimes to prove to investors to raise your next round that your idea is viable and that you've made progress, you need to have that integrated works like, looks like prototype so that there is something they can not just see and say, ooh, that looks very nice, like a looks like model, but have it work and function as well so that it's sort of that experiential model as well. And obviously, I know Kyle will talk a lot later about each of these stages has increasing complexity around the documentation that is required. But once you've got that integrated looks like, works like prototype, there is some more sort of documentation to be done. It's the nuts and bolts of making sure that everything is set up for starting the production process. I would say CM selection usually happens at this point. Hopefully you're running a robust RFQ so that it's a competitive process that will help you find the best manufacturing partner or partners. And then you sort of, once you've got that production ready prototype, you start to enter what's called NPI or new product introduction, which has some pretty distinct phases typically. I think there are multiple terminologies, but the most common one you may hear is EVT, DVT, and PVT. And that's sort of a process to ramp up. At each stage, again, you're ironing out different factors and facets of your product, of your design, of the engineering. And that whole process of NPI ramp, if you will, is designed to get to stable mass production where, you are regularly making 10,000 units a week or whatever it is. I try to keep that concise, but I know it's a bit long-winded, so.
No, this is a great overview. I think what makes a lot of sense is we can kind of start from the top there and just go back through and talk about, what are some of the biggest issues that we run into at each stage? And then also what are some of the things that we can put in place to help correct for some of those issues? So I think the first one you mentioned, I had it written as theory and benchtop design. I think you said evaluation. Is that right? That's what you call it at Alloy? Right. Yep. So makes a lot of sense. You're basically trying to understand what are all the criteria for your design, is what it sounds like a lot to me. In my mind, I see the two really high level trajectories for this stage are digging out the known unknowns and discovering the unknown unknowns. So, but the first one, digging out the known unknowns. All the people in your organization, or even customers, a lot of people have information about the product you're building that you may or may not have communicated across the team and across the organization. And so one of the things I like to think about is how can we best just dig that information out from everybody? And I guess, Keita, do you have any good strategies that you use for collaborating around the different stakeholders, whether it's customer, whether it's business, whether it's costing, to just make sure everyone's on the same page? Because I see a lot of times, teams will start designing on a product, get several months through a design and realize, this thing is maybe twice as expensive as it should be, or, oh, you didn't tell me it had to get wet or be submerged. And all of a sudden we have a completely new product to design. So I guess those would be a couple of the issues I see. Maybe any strategies for kind of pulling out that info.
That is a great question. I think, a couple things that come to mind. One is my colleagues at Alloy are really fond of saying, and I think it's really true, you can't rush the creative process. And so I know what's difficult, especially for startups sometimes, is you are used to running, a marathon at a sprint pace because you have to in order to make it to where you want to go. And so I think it can be frustrating sometimes when folks who are used to that, working in those early stages of product development are sort of asking questions that you may think as trivial. But to your point, Kyle, and this is where, Dragon and I've sort of adopted this as well, was very fond of saying that early decisions cast long shadows. And part of it is if you find out later, back to my rule of 7s or 8s, if you find out in the, you've already made your injection molded, you've already made your molds, you've invested the costs to purchase steel tools. If then someone comes in and says, oh, just kidding, the finishes need to adhere to this industrial design that we're applying way after the fact, you've kind of, everything comes to a screeching halt. That was a requirement that maybe wasn't, found out at those earlier stages. So I think the point is spend time. And I know time is at a premium, but spend time in the early stages, get everybody in the room. I think if I may be bold, and this is coming from the business side, look, if you are making a startup that has a physical good, you won't have a business unless you have a product to sell. But the product doesn't sell itself in a vacuum. You have to have a business model. And so it's always, there are almost always business requirements that are actually going to inform the product. This is where feature creep comes in too. I think a lot of times, not just the engineers, but like the marketing people will be like, oh, isn't it great? Let's just add a few LEDs because we really, want it to light up in a rainbow array when X, Y, and Z function happens. And then the problem is from the product side, you're like, sure, we can add some light pipes. But that's a pretty costly development effort sometimes. And without both sides understanding where those trade-offs are, I think, to your point, Kyle, you can end up designing a product where the cost per unit is going to be $50, but the marketing side, the business side, the sales side is saying, oh no, we don't have the margins we need in order to have a business. So it's got to be those early conversations, get all the people in the room at the same time, make sure the business requirements are also informing and being informed by the product requirements.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot. And oftentimes it's that the marketing team or even business teams or industrial designing teams don't, and of course they don't understand all the implications for the requests or the features that maybe they want to go into the product. And it seems like having either that, a long back and forth discussion, or I wonder if there are even some more quantitative measurements that you use to basically gauge, well, marketing or industrial design may say, hey, I want LEDs or light pipes. One of the things I used to do is say, okay, how much do you want LEDs or light pipes? And they would say a lot. And I'd say, okay, now how about in dollars and cents? Right. And then we could have a bit more of a quantitative discussion around that. We've also started recommending to a lot of our customers that they actually use just a number from 1 to 5 in terms of feature priority for different products, different features, in terms of how important they are to the customer.
Yeah, I think that's a great methodology. It's some way to tease out the information of what is most important. Dragon was fond of talking about the manufacturing triangle. So it's the interplay of cost, quality, and schedule. And what's interesting at Alloy, we turn that on its head just a little bit. And we basically say quality is a given, right? Nobody wants a low quality product. But what that third leg of the stool is at Alloy is scope. So a lot of that's listening to our clients, be they startups or Fortune 500 companies, and basically saying like, okay, what is the most important driver to them? Because if it is really just we need 10,000 units a year from now, that's an aggressive schedule. I mean, depending on where you are in the process. And so then schedule becomes sort of the driving force, maybe more than scope. So we kind of have to say, okay, if we've only got a year to play with, we're probably not going to be able to add wireless charging. Because, based on how many new things you're trying to add in, I think in that case, coming back to your 1 through 5 schedule, your counterpart, it's not just items in the bill of materials or features that have a 1 through 5. It's also the business factors. For startups, we have an investor presentation, January 15th, and come hell or high water, we have to have something that's working, at the highest fidelity possible. And sort of that becomes their driving force.
It's funny you mentioned wireless charging, because I've seen multiple products where wireless charging gets on the chopping block sometime in the development process, whether it's at the beginning or actually in some cases about 2 years into product development.
Yeah. I'd actually love to chat about that maybe later today when we're talking about trends, because I'd be curious, specifically with wireless charging, everybody wants it. So is it sort of, the technology is not quite there yet, or, who's doing cool stuff on platforms that will make it easier to do integrations on that front?
Yeah. I mean, the quick line there is there's a lot of things to start thinking about with wireless charging, from compliance to costs, including licensing costs. Or we have a question later on, which is what do you design in-house versus subcontract out? I think wireless charging is a great example there of, you can really drive that cost down by designing your own, but you're going to be paying the development cost in salaries. So you better amortize that over a large quantity of products.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great segue to our next question, which was, how do you make the decision of when to design in-house versus outsourcing it? What are some of the criteria that make it a good use case for one or the other?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. I obviously work in this business, but I'm happy to sort of look. The thing is, you always have to do what's best for your business. And it's actually a good time to talk about this as we're thinking of, that overall timeline, the overall stages of production. I think oftentimes during that evaluation stage, during the ideation stage, is when you should be figuring out also what team, which individuals, including what third-party firms or individuals will I need to bring to the table. And to Kyle's point, with the example of wireless charging, unless somehow you have on your team someone who's a PhD, R&D level wireless charging, maybe owns the or is their name's on the patents for some of these things. And if you did manage to hire that person, good for you. Part of the reason people say hardware is hard or hardware is unforgiving is because you cannot do it all in-house. And that goes for your Fortune 50 companies, mostly, as well as, your pre-funding startup. Unless you want to get in the business of owning your own factories, your own physical plants. And I would argue, maybe if you're trying to make a consumer electronic hardware device, you probably also don't want to be in the business of owning physical plants. But, that is a huge capital expense and also fairly small margins. So, you're going to be relying on manufacturing partners, supply chain partners. When you are building your bill of materials, there's going to be there are going to be generic parts. There are going to be assigned components where you are very specific. We must use this Broadcom chip. We must use these capacitors, and please specify, they need to be unleaded. One of those sort of fun examples was, don't forget to specify you cannot have lead in your product. And then there will be components that are consigned. And so that might be something where if you have critical IP or other subsystems that you are very concerned about protecting, you may make those in-house. You may make those with a tertiary supplier that has no contact with your main CM, or you may do the assigned components for strategic purposes. You can do things to protect your IP, like we need 10,000 units, and this is my critical component, my critical IP. So I'm only going to give the factory 10,000 of these because I am going to certify that all of them work. Maybe it's probably good to build in a little bit of buffer, but that way, you're protecting yourself as well. So point of all that is many third parties that you need to work with. And so on the CM side, that may be obvious. But I think some other things to think about when you design in-house versus outsourcing to a development firm, it's again, those trade-offs of cost, schedule, and scope. And schedule is a tricky one. And Valentina and Kyle, I'd be curious to have your opinions on this too. But there's a phrase from the Navy SEALs, I think, that's slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Or did I get that backwards? Anyway, the point is, coming back to my initial statement of you can't rush the creative process. You may feel you're crawling at a snail's pace at the beginning if you outsource things. But the point is, you are making sure that in terms of horsepower, all the horses are going to be running in the same direction. And so you'll actually, at the end of the, as you get further down the process, you're going to be able to move a hell of a lot faster, possibly, than if you're trying to do everything internally. Now, that said, product development is very costly if you're working with an outsourced firm. So there are definitely other options, particularly if you're, cash strapped as a startup. I love folks who are very scrappy and creative. The ODM model is still one that's out there that can be explored, where the factory you contract with may have design engineers on staff who can take on some of the aspects. If you don't kind of care how the sausage is made, for certain subsystems or for the whole thing, you can kind of hand them prototypes and say, here's one, make 10,000, don't care how you make it. But it depends, again, where your trade-offs are and what your priorities are.
Yeah, I always say that nowadays, every hardware company, it's a distributed company. Everyone's managing a distributed team or remote team in some capacity, either for your supply chain, your specialty design, or for something else. But as you were saying, it's some of the pieces end up being not in-house one way or the other, which has brought up to light the focus on collaboration and making sure that all of these things are working smoothly together. And as you were saying, sometimes the risk is not in the subcomponents, is in the integration of all of the pieces. And as hardware products get more and more complex, and now we have this added layer of the software running on it as well, that's where we see a lot of the problems happening, like in this kind of interconnection points between teams, which makes collaboration super important. And for that, I wanted to ask Kyle to talk about some of your favorite tools or some of the things that you suggest for hardware teams to use on this side.
Yeah, I mean, as many of you know, the part of the reason that our company exists is because the availability of collaboration tools and hardware is lagging behind many other industries a bit. But I will say we definitely see lots of tools applied to hardware collaboration that maybe people wouldn't think of initially as collaboration tools. For instance, one might be, we see very often, is Google Docs or a OneNote. That's one very free-form way to at least just contain information that you may gather during product design. I mean, the beautiful thing about those tools is you can essentially include anything, whether it's screenshot, text, data. You can find a way to kind of link all that stuff together. And from that standpoint, it is and can be a really helpful thing. The downside, I'm sure we'll talk about a bit, is that those tools are completely freeform in the sense that you either need to be incredibly principled in terms of building your own procedure for how to enter in documents into Word documents or OneNote documents or Google documents. Otherwise, they end up being very complex, very difficult to find data. One way we try to address this recently is actually just put together a design review checklist documentation. So that integrates with our Allspice tool and essentially pre-populates a checklist of information that you can go through at every design review and make sure that you've ticked each of those boxes. It's much easier to say, grab a chunk of a checklist and say, you know, this isn't relevant for us for this product or maybe this review, get rid of it, than it is to try to rethink of every time you're doing a design review, what are all the things I need to check here? So that's one of the things we tried to add, which kind of bridges between both documentation and collaboration, because this is this document that you can start to point to say, okay, we did our diligence, but also share with your teammates and get feedback on, so that you don't have two people going back and forth and trying to both see, did you add ESD protection on a particular input, or do you have connector clearance? If you've basically documented the fact that, yes, I've evaluated it, here it is, that saves both parties a lot of time.
Yeah, I was thinking when I worked at Amazon, we had this, it's kind of what are the different ways that you can prevent failure? And so if you think about safety, right, like you can go all like very simple from like putting a sign that something is dangerous to like re-engineering the process in a way that like that accident will never happen whatsoever. And I see a similar process happening in the hardware space where like if you think of a Google Doc, the solution is like process away the kind of what the pitfalls could be. And then the tools are getting more and more sophisticated to the point that like that is automated to the point that eventually like you won't be able to make those mistakes anymore because it will just be engineered away out of it. But it's kind of like early in the process still where like the best that you can do is just put like a warning somewhere that like, hey, make sure to check this. But as things evolve and technology gets farther along, it's going to become a point where like you just won't be able to make those anymore. But one of the most popular tools that I hear whenever we talk to customers is it's actually Jira, which is a traditional software tool for collaboration, but has been very widely adopted for hardware teams. A lot of people like it because of their ticket tracking. That seems to be the strongest pull for it. And then high-level status overview of projects. That being said, what ends up happening, which I'm curious if someone else has a different experience, but whenever I talk to someone about Jira, what happens is because it has better software support than hardware support, it becomes a reporting tool for management. So something that the hardware engineers still don't quite fit in that universe, work somewhere else outside, call it Google Docs, Excel, GitHub issues or something like that, and then go back to Jira to report the status to management. So it becomes like a communication tool between engineering and business, but not something that kind of where the hardware team develops itself. But so that's one of the most popular ones that we see with like some of the pros and cons of adopting things like that are meant for software, but that people use it for hardware as well. I think a lot of the a lot of the collaboration tools, their focus is also on supporting documentation, which is one of the other topics that people ask a lot about. And how can you, why is documentation important? How can you like support your documentation at your company better? And the way I think about documentation is there's a couple of things why it matters or why people do it or kind of what are the benefits. The first one, which is the most obvious for certain companies, if you work in aerospace or medical devices, is just compliance. It's like in certain cases, it's not a, I would like to have it. It's like you kind of need to have it. But outside of that, it's kind of a threefold. It's troubleshooting. So anytime a problem happens down the road, figure out where the mistake and the breakdown was. The more detailed your documentation, the faster and the easier you can track that and you can address the problem. The second one is knowledge transfer, which means anytime someone leaves a team, changes companies, changes projects, or even if you're like, it's a project that was 2 years old, we put it on the bench and now it's back on the dock, and like kind of transferring all that information from the design intent, even if within the same project, if you're still working on it from the beginning, by the time you get to mass production, like the decisions that you made on the third day about what design theory to like put down, you don't probably remember. So kind of keeping all that information in one place. And then the third one is kind of a forcing function to help you check your design along the way. So by having to do the documentation of the processes, it kind of forces you to check for things. And as you're doing that, chances are that you're going to find out a few bugs along the way, just for the fact of like basically writing everything down. At the end of the day, it all comes down to speed. It's a way to spend a little more time right now to avoid like spending. It's kind of like the early decisions cast long shadows. If you spend a little bit of time in the documentation, like on day 3, that probably means you're going to spend a month less of troubleshooting down the road somewhere. But some people call it insurance. I like to think of it as an investment instead. It's something that you put down as you go, that it ends up, a lot of people think like, oh, more documentation takes more time. It actually ends up taking you less time down the road, just because you can basically save some of these later problems from happening.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually a good segue too, because I was going to suggest here that one of the best things that you can do for documentation is integrate it into your design workflow. This is primarily for all the engineers out there, but the worst thing in the world is grinding for weeks or months on a design and then realizing that, okay, now it's out or it's about to go out and I have to go back and document everything. Much better to actually build that into your workflow, whether it's testing, whether it's specifications, saying, I'm going to build this regulator. First thing you do is just go to a notebook and say, these are the criteria that I'm going to design this thing against. Then you have something you can send out. Again, make sure you verify with people that you can design to, and then put your results in, and kind of sequence it as you're going through this design. And if you can be slightly principled around that, it greatly reduces the amount of time that you'll have to then take at the end to sit down and say, like, I have to go back and document this. One tool specifically that helps a lot in this, and I'm surprised more people don't use in hardware, is a ticket tracker or issue tracker. Often thought about as a way that management can say, catalog my time as an engineer, but really it's such a useful engineering tool to say, as an engineer, this is what I'm working on, and this is all the information associated around it, so that at the end I can go and collect all that, or even use that as my documentation to collect all of my information, to organize it, and also link it to different projects. We've enabled revision control and issues tracker in Allspice, but there are other tools. Even if your teams are using GitHub, you'll have access to GitHub issues. You can link them to firmware, to hardware, tag other people. It's such a great tool for collaborating. If you prefer something a little more freeform, of course, there are also, OneNote's a good, OneNote or Notion is a tool that we use a lot actually for software development, Allspice, but it's a great hardware tool as well.
Yeah, and then the question that we received the most was actually about trends and kind of what we see happening in the space at a high level, what gets us excited about new things happening in hardware development. So let's kick it off with you, Kyle.
Absolutely. So some of the general things that I see are most exciting are some of the digitization of component information. It's really exciting to me because so much of the information that we want to find, especially as engineers, is stuck in a PDF somewhere and is so difficult to find. I get really excited by the fact that a lot of, especially manufacturers, are starting to digitize that component information and that data sheet information and make it more publicly available. For instance, if you go to a lot of capacitor manufacturers are doing this, like Chemet, if you go to their website, you can start to see and actually download and manipulate that component information. So that's pretty exciting for me. On the same vein, some of the manufacturers for microcontrollers and chips are starting to build a lot more code template generators. I love MX Cube Studio. Fantastic tool for just getting from 0 to 1 on a production design. And again, it's part of this like digitization of the component information. In this term, it's like a chip. And then finally, in also a similar vein, is this integration that I see improving around the CM and designer interface. So a lot more CMs are accepting a lot more information, accepting different information formats like raw design files. If you have the IP considerations that you can allow that, it's a fantastic way to communicate more information to the CMs to make sure they're building the right product and understand the changes that are being made. I think the holy grail is when all of these systems start to integrate a little better and communicate on a standard language, which we're always interested in, always working on. But even in general, just seeing all of these industries improve is really exciting.
What about you, Kata?
Oh, I don't want to be the pessimist here, but I do think it's important to talk, as we're talking about hot trends, that we're excited about. I also think it's important to talk about like what are the trending topics that, I don't want to say keep me up at night, but maybe keep my clients up at night. And so I do think it is really important to mention, the global electronic component shortage that is still ongoing. And it's a component shortage, but it's also a supply chain disruption. And without getting into too much history, I mean, during my Dragon days, Dragon was owned by Avnet, which I think is the largest electronic components distributor globally still. And so there was electronic component shortage back then, very difficult to get to capacitors, for example. It impacts large companies and small. The problem for startups is you're going, I only need, 10 capacitors per product, and I'm only making 250,000 devices. So like a fairly small number of capacitors. And then you look at how many capacitors are in the Ford F-150 computer boards, how many capacitors are on your iPhone 12. And you can understand why if a distributor has a choice between giving Apple or Ford the capacitors that they need for their products and giving you, your 200 per product or however many I just said, you're going to be pushed to the bottom of the pile. So I was listening to an event earlier this week where a VC I very much admire was saying she was shocked and appalled that some of their portfolio companies have resorted to like trolling eBay for various components. I don't know if it's capacitors. Kyle, you'll have a better thumb on this than I. But certainly, sensors and certain chips, it's an issue. So there was a shortage back 2 years ago. I think it recovered slightly, but then we were hit by, tariff wars globally, which had a big impact. And then there was a global pandemic, which is still, we're seeing the after effects of that. I do think this will continue for a long time. Eventually, I do think we'll get back to normal. Let's be positive about that. So there's a positive trend, but I do think right now it behooves anyone making physical products in the hardware space, the connected space, to plan ahead and then make a plan B and then make a plan, B.1, C, D, et cetera. Consider whether you need to dual source your critical components. So again, to Kyle's point, if you've identified on a 1 through 5 scale, certainly those highest risk components or, cost driving components, I think it's just be very aware on a per component basis, what the lead times are for everything that goes into your product and your packaging as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. The lead time for a startup to get a component, even 1,000 components, sounds like could actually be even greater than, a larger company trying to get a larger size of components just because of that relationship. And the buying power is not there. I mean, I think you'll see echoes of this throughout that supply or throughout the product development process, where I can't tell you how many times startups come in and they're like, we want Apple quality, in the plastics. We want it to be white. We want it to be high sheen.
however you're going to define your CMF, your colors, materials, and finish. And the problem is you might want Apple quality, but you're going to pay for it. And you can't demand 120-day payment terms like Apple can. And so, understand what the echoes of demanding Apple quality have throughout your schedule and your cost and everything else, and particularly now. So again, I know I brought us down and being a pessimist, but I do think it's important to be aware of, no matter what stage you're at, it's the quotes you're seeing, if they're 6 months old, it's like, oh, sure, you can get these chips, these sensors in 12-week lead times. It's probably not 12 weeks anymore.
Yeah, so as you say, Apple, one of the things I think about when thinking of trends is how the lines are blurring between what's a hardware product and what's a software product. I feel like a lot of hardware companies are becoming software companies and the other way around. And I see kind of a tighter integration going forward of the development as well. So it used to be that software development happens in this schedule, in this side of the wall, in this methodologies, and hardware has its own version of it. And we see more and more kind of the interconnections, because these products nowadays, they require a higher integration. And so getting people to be in similar schedules, like we hear a lot of hardware companies that run on 2-week design sprints and stuff like that, which maybe like 5 years ago, hardware like wasn't aware of, like that's how software gets developed or whatever. Sharing tools and practices. We see a lot of teams making the move to Git, or doing like Agile, or using Kanban boards, or using ticketing systems and tracking. So it's kind of like the blending of those two worlds together. That gets me really excited, because I think going forward, the successful hardware companies are going to be those that have like very well integrated products where the software and the hardware kind of run side by side and operate very well. And with that, I'll ask Kyle. So speaking of this kind of trend of merging software with hardware practices, what are some of the practices you most commonly see used in hardware, or what are some of the trends you see there?
So we mentioned Jira as part of a ticket tracker, and so that's starting to pull hardware engineers into this broader ecosystem. Again, the integrations really aren't completely there yet, so it is making it difficult to integrate in some ways. But there are a couple areas that are a bit exciting. One is that many startups, pretty much every hardware startup I see, is doing their electronics revision control, at least initially, using GitHub or GitLab or some other Git hosting product. It's just so much easier, especially since a lot of times, especially at a smaller company, you're having these generalist electronics and hardware engineers come in that are doing electronics and firmware design. Just so much easier for them to stay in the same system. And those tools do work for hardware designs as well. Granted, there's more you need to figure out about how it interfaces with CAD designs. The other thing that gets me excited, and something that we actually started doing a lot in our 3D printing startup that I was at, is actually building a continuous integration and continuous test process for hardware designs. We had actually set up we call them roadkills, but essentially a blown up version of the product that we had on a benchtop that was connected to the network, which anytime we built a new version of the firmware code, would actually go and run physically a series of tests on the device to make sure we hadn't broken anything. And we were able to actually discover a lot of issues before they went into products like that. It would actually jog, in this case, it was our gantry, around the printer every single time to make sure that we hadn't introduced a new firmware bug that was, say, going to crash this thing or make it ignore the end stops or something like that. I see that becoming more and more powerful as we can start to integrate, as Valentina mentioned, the electronics and the firmware process even more. Valentina, you are muted, I should point out.
Thanks for that. I was going to say we're just over the 45-minute mark, and those were all the questions people sent us today. But if you have any other questions or want to get in contact with us, our email is info@allspice.io and info@alloypd.com. It was a pleasure talking to you all today. Hopefully you enjoyed the session. And yeah, if you have any more questions, send them our way. Thanks for joining.